Hello, everybody. Welcome and thank you for joining in for the fall edition of CFIC's Conference for Inquiry 2021. I'm John Varghese, and as chair of the Communications Committee for the Center for Inquiry Canada, I'm privileged to take on this role of welcoming you all to this event.
Welcome back, everyone. And there's just a moment of, we'll say, technical engagement just to ensure the slides run well and that Kathleen's audio is good and audible. My intro to Kathleen is brief as per instructions, but we'll note that she is the founder and has a consultancy, KMG, which works in the important area of integration and diversity in workplaces. And as you can tell from her bio, comes down a very interesting path in life, and is here to speak to us about a very interesting, how would I say, a very interesting place in a marginalized community, often marginalized within the community, from which we can learn well. I only wish we had some people with CFI available to talk in a panel format with Kathleen about their experiences being marginalized in an often marginalized community. But if technically we're ready to go, with no further ado, please let's welcome Kathleen Johnson.
I'm very honored to speak to you today about my experience as a Black atheist, and it's been a journey for me. I thought I would make it a little more on the personal side. Historically, as you can imagine, being religious in the Black community is very important. Current stats that I've been aware of is 87% of Black people in the diaspora. So that's whether you're African, Caribbean, American, from Central America, identify as being religious, particularly Christian. So it is a very religious community. And so next slide, please. So as a Black atheist, I must say that I finally feel free. I struggled for a long time being a religious person. I just felt like I was falling short, that I was never getting it right. I had a lot of friends in the Evangelical church. All my friends started going to this church. It was in Scarborough at the time, and highly charismatic Evangelical church. And so I started going with them. I was looking for answers to things because I was a new mom and I was struggling a lot. I was a single parent, and I found that they were so happy. They were always like joyful, and I was always miserable. And I wanted to know what was the big deal about this place. So I started going, and it became an addiction for me. Like, we were in church Sunday, Wednesday. I think there was 3 days a week I was there. And so but I always felt like they were more spiritually in tune than I was. And I would hear them say things like, well, you just have to pray more, or, you just need to open up to the Holy Spirit more. So I never felt like I was getting this thing right. I never felt like I was discerning enough, which is a word they use a lot in evangelicalism. Just, you have to be discerning and make the right decisions. And I never felt like I was making the right decisions. Next slide. So my early church days, so 2001, I started attending church on a regular basis. I am a bit of a unicorn in that I am not from a religious household per se. My parents largely were loosely Anglican, and we largely went to church on Christmas and Easter. So we were the epitome of really lackadaisical churchgoers. And by the time I became a certain age, my parents just stopped going altogether. But in 2001, when I had my second child, as I said, a lot of my friends from university started going to a very popular evangelical church. The pastor was very young, and he had a young family, and he was educated. He actually went to university, and I was really impressed by that, because I thought, wow, here's a guy who's not like some street corner person, but he's actually educated. And I felt that gave him a lot of credibility with me. And I was attracted to the music as well. I'm a music lover, and the worship was amazing. It's what evangelical, if you're not familiar with a lot of slang in the evangelical church, worship means that's music time. And in terms of tithes and offerings, now that I look back, I do feel it was unfair that I was required to tithe 10% of my income, because I was a single parent. But that was the deal. And at the time, I was a mother of two small boys, and I decided if I'm going to become a part of this, I'm going to go all in. So I did tithe, and I offered, which is apart from your tithing. That's extra giving. And I didn't really have any money as a stay-at-home mom, but my husband worked, and I believed I was following Malachi 3. And for those expats to Christianity in the crowd, Malachi 3 is that scripture that says, the windows of heaven will be opened if you give to the church. So I wanted that blessing. So I tithed, and I offered, and I gave the church my all. In 2005, things really changed for me. And, I became very friendly with a group of people, and we were very, very tight. I didn't realize it was all contingent on my participation in the church. And when my marriage began to fall apart, my so-called friends told me that I couldn't leave that relationship, that I was the representation of Christ in the home, and I had to stand in the gap for my marriage. And stand in the gap means you have to stay and pray it through. And no matter how hard it gets, because God put that relationship together, you are, as a mere mortal, I have no authority to break that apart. So it is literally till death do you part. Next slide, please. So in 2005, I went through a separation, and I found out about an affair, and a child kept secret from me for 4 years in my marriage, and I left my marriage. I moved back to Alberta, where I'm originally from, with my 5 children, and they were, my friends were upset, and they stopped talking to me. They stopped talking to me altogether. But by this time I was 30 years old, and I had 5 kids that were ages 5 months to 8 years old. And I was like, what am I going to do with myself? I've been at home for a very long time. So, but I set new goals, and I really was motivated. Shortly after I moved, I enrolled in school, and I set some new sights for myself. But I knew I believed in God still, and I really wanted to have a relationship with God and find a community, but I knew what I was doing before wasn't working. So I started going to the Mormon church, and I had dated someone in high school who was Mormon, and I always admired their family. They were the nicest people. And I thought, well, if I could even have a little bit of what they had, I would be very blessed. So, I was really broke at the time, and the church really supported me. I must say, they were very helpful. I got food orders from the church, clothes. Other mothers would bring me meals they made. And it was very supportive in a way that I hadn't experienced before. And I felt successful. I finally felt like I got this God thing right. I'm doing it right. Everything was working out for me in terms of, I was going to school. I was, making new friends. I had a new community around me. So I really felt lucky. And I got baptized again in the Mormon faith. And so I was in that church for 13 years. Next slide. So for these years, I felt very blessed. I was a part of something that made me feel wanted. I had a lot of kids, and I must say in my years in the evangelical church, I felt I used to get a lot of comments about having a lot of children, and I always felt bad about myself for that. So Mormon families, as you know, typically are quite large. Maybe not so much nowadays, but a lot of the people in church had 5 kids, 4 kids. So I didn't feel like I was, something was wrong with me for that. And it was service-based, I could be a blessing to others too. It wasn't all, people doing things for me and helping me, and I'm such a sad case. I was encouraged to take part too and serve others. So I really enjoyed that. I still today have many Mormon friends, and those bonds are really strong, and they know where I stand, and they don't really bother me to go back to church. I've actually never heard any one of them say, oh, how come you don't come? Oh, come to church, come to church. So I've been pretty lucky that way. And especially a couple that I knew that kind of really took up for me when I was going through a tough time, and really became my parents. I was estranged from my family for a while, so I really needed that support, especially with a bunch of little kids. And as a single mom of 5, and 4 of my kids have some degree of special needs, including autism. So that came with many trials, to put it in Christian terms. But I felt up for it, with that support in the community that I was in, the Mormon faith that I was in, I felt totally carried through a lot of the difficult times that I had. I was really well supported. My kids did not lack, my kids and I did not lack for love and support. And the vast majority of people were really great to us. Next slide. So a big shift in my life happened, a very pivotal moment. In 2011, my mom passed away. And I was just distraught. And I was distant from my family already. So, I decided to go back to Toronto. And I started working in film and television as a makeup artist. It was always a hobby for me. And then as I got older, I decided to make it a job. And so I was successful in getting into the film union, and I worked in film and television for years when I was in Toronto. But in between that time, I started to pull back from religion, from the Mormon faith in particular. And that was around 2017. So by the time I moved back to Calgary in 2019, I already identified as being an atheist. Next slide. So the other side of paradise, I reconciled that I was not going to, that heaven didn't exist. I was not going there. So now what do I do? Next slide. So with my newfound non-belief, I went through a lot of learning. I had first come across a lot of disturbing information about the Mormon Church and their racist past. And it still took me a little while. I didn't just see that information and just go, okay, well, I'm done. It really took me a little while to mentally disconnect from, everything that I had known about the people being so wonderful. But then it has this really recent, up until the 1970s, a very recent past in relationship with racism. And for those who don't know, as of 1970, in the early 1970s was finally when Black men were able to become part of the priesthood in the Mormon Church, and that's really a big deal because every man in the Mormon Church is considered a priest. And so for Black men to be excluded from that, it was, solely based on the color of their skin. And this was upheld by the church since its inception. So there really was no excuse to still be doing that in 1970. And it was only under political pressure that they stopped doing that. So I wasn't happy to learn that. And then I learned some other things that I thought, wow, they really don't tell you everything when you sign up. that were just unbelievable in terms of, just their basic beliefs about, things like, Jesus living in outer space on a planet, Kohor, I believe the name is, and it's just like a lot of other things that you try to reconcile, but then you realize there really is no logical basis for this stuff. So then it kind of spirals down from there. And I started listening to a podcast that many of you probably know called the Atheist Experience. And I started listening to those callers because, I saw myself in a lot of them, especially the really vehemently, apologetic Christians. I was once like that. So I really sympathized with a lot of the callers and like, wow, I used to be like that and think like that and say those things. But as a couple years after, I fully identified as an atheist. Next slide. But it was a very lonely place to be. I was the only atheist that I knew for a long time. And but I felt lost for sure. I felt lonely, but I also felt empowered at the same time. I was glad that I finally found myself, and the wonders of nature and science were starting to make sense to me. And I didn't really need God to be a part of that framework. I didn't need to say, oh, wow, look at that tree. God is great. He's wonderful. I started to understand why and how that tree is there. And I was so happy to have that concrete knowledge that I could make sense of things around me. As far as my family and my kids attending church, because a lot of people would ask me that, like, how did your kids take it when you told them that you weren't going to church anymore and that you didn't believe in God anymore? And actually, they surprised me because they never gave me trouble to go. They always enjoyed going, whether when we were in the Evangelical church, especially when we were Mormon, and they never gave me a problem. So I thought they really enjoyed going, and I thought I was really taking something fundamental away from them. But they were actually pretty relieved. And they said that they didn't want to go to church anymore anyways. They were just going to make me happy. So I didn't really have an issue, telling my kids that we weren't going to church anymore. And as far as the community, though, I did feel like I was a traitor. I didn't tell anyone Black that I was atheist for many months. I felt like a traitor. All the struggles that the Lord had brought us through, like slavery and decades of oppression, is really a hardwired concept in the Black community. And when you step outside of that, you really feel like you're doing something against your people. Next slide. So this plays into the Black and strong trope, with suffering. The Black culture is synonymous with worshiping God due to our history of suffering and our identity. Being believers is a part of Black identity, especially for Black women, as we are seen as the rock of the community. I think everybody can picture that stereotypical Black lady that goes to church every Sunday with her hat and her gloves and and strength. It was God that gave us the trial of slavery to make us strong, to make us as strong as we are as Black people. So turning your back on that tradition and that history can really be problematic in a lot of spaces. And it just goes, I mean, now we're learning a lot more about mental health and about self-care and about how these kind of characterizations of being stronger than strong and being able to get through anything are not really serving us. And I think we're slowly waking up to that in the Black community, that we can't just pray and rely on God for things, that we have to support each other. We have to take practical action and steps, that we're not stronger than everybody on the planet, and we have needs, and we're weak sometimes. So in my atheism, I have found a relief from that pressure of being, of having to weather any storm, and through Christ I can go through anything. I don't feel the need to be superhuman anymore. Next slide. So in conclusion, being a Black atheist, the atheist world has its issues. It's not a perfect world. It is like a lot of other spaces in North America. It's largely white and male dominated. Most of the prolific speakers that I have researched, that first got me through those early years of being an atheist, were white men. And non-belief is generally seen in the Black community as a quote unquote white thing. And I would hear that sometimes, like, oh, you don't believe in God? Oh, girl, you're doing that white thing now. But among many in the Black community, they find solace and support in their church community. So I don't really knock how they think. And the community that I formed on Facebook, Critical Black Thought Society, is that space where Black believers and non-believers can come together, and people that are believing can question, because quite often in the church, the environment is not conducive to questioning. So they can ask questions there, they can let out their feelings there, and it gives everybody a chance to try to understand each other. So that concludes my talk, and I guess I'll open it up for questions now.
Yes, I had to unmute myself, just as perhaps some others had to be muted. As I noted in the chat, please put your questions in chat for Kathleen, and we'll try to get to them in an orderly manner. Just to kick off, since nobody else has put anything in there, is that you noted that your parents were Anglican, and when you left that community and went to another congregation, it was Evangelical, and then you went to the Mormon community. I'm just wondering if you could speak to any differences you saw or felt between the congregations, and any thoughts you might have had at the time moving from one to the other about their worldview, about their theology and other practices.
There's quite a difference. In the evangelical church, it's very strict. I don't know if every evangelical church is like that, but the one I was in, it was, you didn't play sports. You didn't associate with anyone outside of the religion, particularly that church. And it was more of a literal living of the scriptures. And then I go to the Mormon church, and surprisingly, this is not as strict. I mean, they're celebrating Halloween, they're doing yoga, they're very different. So I think I've kind of felt a little more liberated in the Mormon church, like, oh, wow, I'm able to do this, and my kids are able to watch this, and they're able to listen to this music. And so I started kind of loosening up a little bit. And Anglican, I just never really gave that a thought in terms of it being a faith community that I wanted to grow in or raise my children in, because nothing that I had against it, but the only exposure I had to the Anglican church was kind of like my mom's old church buddies crowd. And I just felt like it was like stale. It wasn't, you know, it wasn't for young people. It wasn't for people my age. It was kind of like, you know, for older people to kind of get together and have tea. And just, but yeah, I with philosophy wise, Mormonism is worlds away from uh, garden variety Christianity. I can see why other Christians don't even regard it as Christianity. They have their own Book of Mormon that they more closely follow because they believe that it's closer, it's uncorrupted because it only passed through Joseph Smith's hands, whereas the Bible passed through many hands. So they regard it as more true than the Bible, and it's quite different. As I learned, Joseph Smith was quite the con artist, to be frank. And there's scriptures in there that have just really nothing to do with anything else in Christendom.
Yes. So Leslie had a question which naturally follows on from the question I asked, which is that there are significant differences theologically in aspects of worldview between the Anglican worldview, aspects of the Evangelical, and Mormonism. And he asked, did you feel, and what are your thoughts on any sense of cognitive dissonance, the stress between those as you moved from one to the other?
Well, in terms of my own kind of mental gymnastics that I had to do to make a lot of things make sense, I really didn't know a lot about the Mormon church on the level that I was on, the level that I was in the church. It's just once you get into more investigation and learning about what the beliefs are, that you kind of start to go, oh, I don't think this really makes sense. But like I said earlier, I found the environment so positive and the people so positive, and I always felt supported. They got me through the toughest times. Like I said, I was a single mom of a bunch of little kids, and I went through my share of tough days. And somebody in the church was always there. And whether I needed food that month, or whether I needed a ride somewhere, or a job connection, anything that I could imagine, I just had to put the need out there, and somebody in the church tried to meet that need. So I think that's why it took me 13 years to really kind of start breaking away from the Mormon church. It took me a lot longer. With evangelicalism, I think I was having so many issues with people in the church. I was really hurt when a lot of my friends said, no, you have to stay in this situation, and they knew what was going on, that I felt like they were actually supporting my husband and not supporting me. And I saw, sorry, questions come up in the chat, but then they quickly kind of disappear. But somebody asked if my husband was a churchgoer, and no, he wasn't. And so that's why I was told to stay in that situation and be an example, be the example of Christ for him, so that he might turn to Christ one day. And in the Mormon church, I wasn't being told that. I was being told that he had certain responsibilities and obligations to be faithful, and that because he wasn't willing to do that, that I had every right to walk away. So I was being quite different messages I was being told from each church.
Right. So we have a kind of double-barreled question from Alex. His first question says, during your church years, did you feel that indoctrination turned you into a kind of robot? Curious thing to ask. And then secondly, did you feel that the church members' support for you was contingent on buying into their theology?
That is definitely how I felt in the evangelical church. I think it was just more upfront and obvious. You're with us or you're against us. In the Mormon church, it wasn't so obvious. They have a long courtship, let's say, where they would send the missionaries over to your house. And especially if you were in obvious need like I was, they would just start showing up, chit-chatting, showing you support, talking to you, and just really showing that they cared. And they did that for a long time, until one day I said, hey, I'd like to come to church with you guys. And I kind of didn't feel as indoctrinated in the Mormon church. I think because a lot of evangelical tradition is so in your face, it's a lot easier to see where it's coming from. But with the Mormon church, a lot of their tactics are a lot more subtle. So it did take me a longer time personally for me to say, ooh, I'm being brainwashed here big time. Yeah, so that's my answer for that.
Thanks. France asks, first, thank you for creating the community with a purpose. And her question is, did you witness or experience direct racism in the Mormon church?
A couple of times I did. I was actually dropping something off for another mother. The women's group in the church was very tight with each other, very active. Another mother had a need, and I was dropping something off for her. And just the way her husband kind of looked at me, and he wouldn't even let me in the house to drop it off. He just motioned to leave it on the step. And it's just those kinds of subtle things. Nobody said anything to me directly, but a couple times I did feel like, I don't really belong here. So, I mean, I wasn't always in the same congregation because we did move to different parts of the city. And when we were in the north end of the city in one church, it did feel like there's some people there that they didn't want me there. But then I went to another congregation, and nobody made me feel that way at all. So it was really just the learning that I did, the things that I became aware of about their policies. Like I said, well into the 1970s, where I thought, I can't find any justification for this. And then further back in church history, I came across some quotes by Brigham Young that were very disturbing. And Joseph Smith making statements about his black servant at the time. I can't remember her name now. But he had been known to say that she would still be continuing to serve him in the afterlife. So there were things like that I didn't agree with.
Sandra asked a question that you touched on earlier about your husband being a member of the Evangelical church, who had been, but her add-on, I think, is important in relation to, did you understand after a point that particular church or congregation was misogynistic?
Yes. I think I really started to feel, I was going through, I don't know, like if anybody has been through a lot of trauma, when it's hitting, when you're in it, you're kind of numb and you don't really think about anything. You're just focused on, I gotta get out of here. And then when you get out, you're focused on, I gotta survive, I gotta survive. So it was only until, it wasn't until I actually got out of the Mormon church that I realized how misogynistic the evangelical environment was. I mean, and how it upholds men over women in terms of a lot of the things that I experienced. I heard other women starting to talk about, and it just really started to hit me that this wasn't anything to do with them really believing that it was God's structure, that men were over women. It was deliberate. It was a deliberate tactic used to keep the women subjugated, because it was the women that were making up the majority of the church, and the women that were the volunteers. It was the women that were the ones that were tithing, that were giving the money, that were keeping the church going. So they really wanted to keep women in a certain mindset, and so that they could keep them under control.
Well, thanks for that. Dave McDonald asked a particularly important question, especially given what you'd said as to what you learned in the course of your research into the early history of the Mormon Church. His question is the role of Christianity played in the oppression and assimilation of Black people historically at all? Was it at all recognized in any of the churches or congregations you attended?
No, no, it wasn't. And more disappointingly, mostly I'm disappointed with the Black church that I went to. It was a Black evangelical church that I went to, and our history with that was never discussed at all. It was really a lot of showmanship, and not even really a lot of reading the scriptures. I read my Bible a lot, but a lot of people in church didn't, and a lot of people in church didn't follow the rules like I was following the rules, so no, they didn't acknowledge it at all, really. I mean, I know about it mostly because of my knowledge of Black American history, but I can't say that it was ever taught to us in church at all.
Joan asks, noting that she's curious as to whether any of your children believe in a higher power, and what your feelings and response might be if any of them decided to join a church.
Yes, my eldest does. My eldest does still believe in God. And if they decided to go to church, when I left the church, like I had mentioned, I didn't expect them to follow suit. I was really surprised when they did, because I thought they would choose to stay in it. A couple of my kids did still continue to go, even after I left, just because they had friends and they did activities in the church. And it wasn't until they kind of, it just wasn't as important to them, and to have those friends, that they left those environments. But if they decided today, as older people, my eldest is 24, that yes, they want, especially, I think especially once you have kids, you start looking for a moral framework to raise them with. And we're just conditioned in this society that naturally that's from a church. So I wouldn't really be surprised. I wouldn't be supportive. I mean, they pretty much know me now. You know, but I wouldn't be like, oh, you got to stop going there. And, you know, unless they started preaching to me and started trying to convert me back, I don't think there would be a problem. I wouldn't have a problem.
Well, this segues nicely to Cato's question, where he noted he'd been in debates with religious persons and they've told him it's only a phase, you'll get over your non-belief. And he has, within his own family, from relatives, heard pretty much the same thing, also adding, you're just annoyed with the religion and you'll get over it. I mean, have you had encounters with such people, and what's been your response and strategy for handling it?
No one's ever told me it's a phase. I mean, I've had people suggest like, oh, come on, you really believe there's not a God? Like, look at the oceans, look at this, look at that. But I think, you know, I know my arguments pretty well. So, you know, whenever I come across anybody that kind of poo-poos on my atheism, or my non-belief, I pretty much know what to say. And I haven't had a lot of it back and forth arguments with people about that. I mean, largely like my fallout with a lot of people that were religious. Like I said, my family's not terribly religious. I do have siblings that go to church. I have a brother in the States that's a newly ordained pastor, but they've never really said anything to me. But if somebody is kind of like, you know, really, you're really an atheist, it's really kind of more what I get, like an eye roll kind of thing. But nobody has really come out and said to me anything like, you know, what you're saying. It's kind of been an easy ride for me in a lot of ways. In being an atheist, I haven't had any family members cut me off or anything like that. I did have friends when I left the Evangelical church. They stopped talking to me because I joined the Mormon church. And I don't even know. I don't really speak to them anymore. It's been years, so I don't even really know if they know I'm an atheist. So yeah, that's kind of where things are at with me and other people and their opinions.
So Leslie has noted that sexism and racism are not unknown in the atheist community. And in your time having left religion, have you experienced racism and sexism directed at you or at anyone else in the atheist community?
Directed at me, no. I haven't. I just noticed that the structures of a lot of organizations, of atheist organizations, are largely white male, and even the board at Humanist Canada, where I sit as the Alberta chair, the Alberta member, they took stock of their own organization and said that, you know, hey, we're not really reflecting Canada, we're not really reflecting atheists because it's largely white men on this board. And so them as a national body for atheism decided that they needed to more accurately reflect, you know, who was actually not a non-believer. So that's the only reason that kind of gives me an inclining into, you know, you just look at the top structure of spaces and you see what's going on. But you know, I just think that it's not necessarily that an organization is racist because they only have, or they primarily have white men there. I think just it's socialization, you know, as well. I mean, women are taught to be the ones that are, you know, the spiritual ones, and we're the intuitive ones. And, you know, so there, aside from religious spaces, there's a lot of spiritual, you know, very quote unquote spiritual spaces that women are, you know, mostly make up those spaces where they're you know, whether that's believing in the ancestors or whether it's tarot card reading, or it's mostly women that do those things. So I think it's just the way that we're socialized, that women are supposed to be. I think it's just quite shocking to people sometimes that I'm a Black woman and I'm not spiritual in any way, or I'm not religious, because it's just unusual. It's just, and I think it's just learned, but it's just socialization. It's learned behavior. So I haven't exactly directly been a victim of racism or you know, directly of sexism. It's just I've seen how structures are set up, and I've seen who is primarily considered an authority in the area of atheism, like a Richard Dawkins or Christopher Hitchens, or I mean, a lot of them that I learned a lot of my non-belief from are white male. So I had to actually dig and find Black female atheists, like Mandisa Thomas, who started Black non-believers in the United States, that I could identify with.
Well, I mean, that's great. And I will note that CFI in the US and Skeptical Inquirer have, excuse me, their webinars hosted by an African-American woman whose name doesn't come to me right now, but things are definitely starting to change. And so just we have one more question, which comes from Larry in Calgary. And he asks, are you a member of any of the atheist groups in Calgary?
Actually, when I moved here, I was started to attend Atheist Republic Calgary meetings. And shortly after, like I think weeks after, I went out to a couple events. A small group of people said, we're going to break off and start our own thing, because we want to more be regarded as humanists. And so we started humanists, a humanist group in Calgary that now is defunct. And now I think it's just Alberta Humanist Association. And I'm a member of that.
Well, that's wonderful. And I will note that Martin has made a point of shamelessly plugging KMJ Coaching and Consulting on the screen. But good service, I'm sure, that many employers can avail themselves of. If we have no more questions at this point, I have to ask whether Gus, Lynn, and Sandra then are ready to move on. And I would heartily invite all to give Kathleen a sign of their appreciation, whether it's the clapping hand or in our chat. Thank you very much, Kathleen. And as I noted earlier, I think it would be great for us to have a panel discussion at some juncture involving persons from minority communities, and particularly women from minority communities. And there are a few people out there who know that there is someone who used to be part of CFI Ottawa who would probably be in a shot, an ex-Mormon woman. So we'll definitely keep you in mind, Kathleen.
Thank you so much. It was such a pleasure to be with you today.